Now, last month we were going through Article 3 and we kind of came up short, I guess. And so, okay. And Scott's going to wrap up a little in Article 3 still, a couple concepts, and then move on to state sovereignty, which is a exciting subject. So we'll trade these.
All right. Is somebody's lights just on outside in the? Oh, there is. Okay. I could come in here and listen. All right. Enoch made point of the eclipse. It's not until the 8th. This is the 5th. But they're out of town. They're traveling. And in fact, we should have been there. Have any of you ever been in the totality path completely? I mean, if you were 98%, you did not see the eclipse. I mean, if you're 99%, you did not see the eclipse. And in the 2017, absolutely, we were in the totality. And I said, I'll never miss another one of these, never. And I mean, really, this sounds really stupid and foolish, but it was almost like, I felt like a little 9-year-old girl, and then unicorns were going to come out from behind the bushes. I mean, it was magical. It was absolutely, stunningly magical. The settling upon the earth of the whole experience was something I said I'd never miss again. So we've been planning since 2017 to be for this 2024 one. We've got a son and his wife and kids that are out in Missouri. We thought this is perfect. You know, we got a landing zone out there. Everything will be great. But we got another daughter that decided to have a baby. At the end of April, we thought, oh, we're going to be okay. We'll be okay. And then they said, no, this baby's maybe about ready to get here. So we got to take care of the rest of their kids. And we didn't get to go. And so I am just kind of heartbroken. I was hoping this time to really see a unicorn. But I am telling you, it is just beyond description. We've had a Native American, a Navajo individual that's talked about it, and in their heritage, it is a sacred experience, and it's not to be, trifled with. So many heritages have some views about this that is pretty incredible, and I would have loved to have been there, but we're not going to be. So we are here tonight. We're grateful for that opportunity, and as was mentioned last time we got together, can you believe it's been a month? And here we are again. I'm trying to pick up where I bobbled the ball last time. We had quite a few slides left over, but you needed to understand a few things before we moved into the Article 4 of the United States Constitution. Article 3 being the judicial job description. So here's where we left off a month ago. And I say, the reason I put this one up again is so that you could kind of pick up where we were before. There was a lawsuit filed that the Brunson brothers were attempting to get the United States Supreme Court to intervene about the 2020 election. And we reviewed chapter and verse about why that would not and should not have ever been given any consideration by anybody, but many thought it was the only hope of a restoration. But literally and truthfully, had it been carried out the way it had been requested, there would have been a complete usurpation of all power in the United States government by 5 judges in the United States Supreme Court. There is not a constitutional authority to do that. And what they were asking for was the unseating of virtually every Democrat in the legislative body, the House and the Senate, many Republicans in the House and the Senate, all of the executive branch. And so you would have had a decimated general government, federal government, national government, however people like to denominate it. And it would have left an oligarchy of 5 judges with all power in the government. So it would have been a usurpation of all power. It was the wrong thing to do. And in spite of so many people having hope of that, the Supreme Court does not have that capability. And had it been done, it would have been a banana republic overnight here, or a coup d'etat, or however you want to say it. There have been many that thought a military coup would have been a good idea too, but that would have been a horrid thing. We'll talk about it sometime if you're interested. So we left on that thought the last meeting, and this was how I was going to continue. And so here we are. We're going to talk about some of the things the Constitution says about treason and attainder, Supreme Court supremacy, and separation of powers. So we'll begin there. Here's where Article 3, Section 3, Clause 2 says punishment of treason. Congressional power to declare punishment, however, no attainder of treason shall work corruption of blood or forfeiture except during the life of the person attainted. Well, everybody understands exactly what that means, and I don't even need to cover that. Okay, wrong, right? Most of us never even think along those lines of thought. The terminology is completely foreign to us. So we thought we better take a little while on that. So first of all, Congress has the power to declare what the punishment of treason is. It specifically says that in Article 3. So 18 U.S. Code, Section 2381, has defined treason thus. Charged officials, whoever owing allegiance to the United States levies war against them or adheres to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort within the United States or elsewhere is guilty of treason and shall suffer death or shall be imprisoned not less than 5 years. Okay, I'll take the 5 years. Anyway, okay. And fined under this title, but not less than $10,000, and shall be incapable of holding any office under the United States. Okay, we talked last time we got together about how carefully the American founding fathers defined treason. This is not something you can, although it is bantered about constantly. Well, they committed treason. What did they do? Well, they put the freeway through my grandmother's backyard. No, that's not treason. Okay, I mean, there's a lot of things where there's a kind of a rhetoric, a passion, and everything else like that. But treason is very carefully defined. And go back and look at what we did last time around, so we don't have to completely redefine that. But treason is a very narrowly defined and then punished crime. So, what's a bill of attainder? Well, what happened and used to happen under the king was that people got declared to be a criminal or outlaw without a trial or conviction. The king would say, we're going to attain that guy. That guy in Parliament would say, okay, thank you very much, King, we'll do that. So, think of Robin Hood. Here's a guy, he never had a trial, but he was declared an outlaw, and so they pointed at him, they touched him, they said, you are an untouchable now, basically. So they get declared to be a criminal without a trial. That's what a bill of attainder is. And the Constitution says you can't do that. The Founding Fathers said the king was wrong in doing this often. So the problem was that the English Parliament used to do this all the time. They didn't even have a hearing. So one that was so fingered or touched or basically identified couldn't inherit property, and neither could his children. So the king is going, now you can kind of see what the temptation would be. Man, that guy's got a pretty nice looking castle, got a good front porch or whatever you're really interested in. And so the king says, that guy's an outlaw. He's a criminal. So he can't have property, and guess what? Neither could his children. And guess who got it? They reverted to the crown. It's kind of, in a way, there's so many similarities between the English monarchy and just outright communist socialistic perspective. It's, the government, whether it's the king or it's the proletariat or whoever, is ownership of and control of the means of production and distribution. So they can take the land, they can take your tools, they can take anything that's your property, and it's theirs. And that's what Stalin did with the kulaks. And in the 1930s, when he wanted their land, they were landed peasantry, and he says, that's going to be collectivized, it's going to be ours. They said, no, it's not. So he surrounded their villages and either starve them out or pound them out with artillery. But the fact was, he took possession of the property. And that's, the king had a way, using a bill of attainder, doing that. So what we had attainder of treason was during the Civil War, U.S. military officers, or those that had been officers of the U.S. government and had taken an oath of office to, when they held their office, like officers do, and then they ended up fighting. The thing that's really interesting to me, by the way, if you look at what the definition of treason is, it's waging war against the states. Who did that? Lincoln. Lincoln was the man. he waged war against the states that tried to withdraw from the Union, which was just like what the Americans did in 1776 when they wrote the Declaration of Independence. They withdrew from that current form of government. They weren't waging war to overthrow that form of government. They just said, we're out. And that's exactly what happened in 1776 in the Declaration of Independence. Go back and read it. Read it in that light, and you'll say, wow, wait a minute. Those guys were just tired of being lorded over. Okay. So those that had been officers in the U.S. military or had been U.S. government officials, taken an oath of office, and they went off to fight on the Confederate cause, they were declared guilty of treason. Okay, so what happened? All their estates were confiscated, and then they were sold. And that's how, for example, Arlington Cemetery came about, was that it was part of Robert E. Lee's plantation, if you will, and they said, we're going to bury our dead here, so you'll never get this back again. I mean, it was by design, but the fact of the matter is there was a lot of other properties that were confiscated and sold of all those officers that were involved in that. So when these treasonous people died, their heir says, we need the property back. And we're demanding this happen. And the people that bought the property said, no, we got a bill of sale. Here, see, it's ours. And the people that were the descendants of those treasonous officers said, no, that's not how it works. So they took it through the courts, and they actually went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, no, you got to give them the property back. What do you mean? I paid good money for this thing, and here's my deed. And the Constitution is very specific. It doesn't corrupt the blood for the future for those that are going to have that property. So they had to return the land to the heirs. Now that, of course, wasn't going to happen with Arlington Cemetery and everything. Who's going to say we got to dig up all the dead guys and do this again? I mean, I'm being a little bit too facetious and maybe almost crude with it, but that's not going to happen, and so that's the way it stayed. But that was a big shock, because the Constitution said that the property could only be taken during the life of the individual, but could not be permanently attainted and kept from the family. So the founding fathers had said, no, we saw what the king did. He seized the property and he kept it, and the family never had it again. And we're not going to let that happen in this country. So that's why that was written in there. So we'll read that again. Article 3, Section 3, Clause 2. The Congress shall have power to declare the punishment of treason, but no attainder of treason shall work corruption of blood or forfeiture except during the life of the person attainted. Okay, so now it makes sense. Here's what happens if you're guilty of treason. Yep, we're going to tell what the punishment is, but you can't affect the next generation's inheritance. Okay, so that's basically where they went with that. So we've talked many, many times, and it's not just in the judicial, but it's in all of the United States government. Hopefully, if we get through everything this evening, we will have, again, reiterated the fact that there was divided and subdivided powers, and they were separated, and the different branches are co-equal. There's no place in the Constitution, you will read it in vain if you're looking for some clause in there that says the Supreme Court is supreme. Okay? It doesn't say that. They're all equal. Okay, now so this is an important thing to remember, that nobody is the king of the road in this. And everybody has a responsibility to make sure they uphold their end of things. They've got to push back when there's an encroachment on their turf, if you will. It's not a collegial kind of thing. Orrin Hatch used to always tell me, oh no, in the Senate, it's a collegial environment, and all of us are, colleagues in this thing. Bravo, Sierra. No, you're not. Everybody fights tooth and nail, and that's the only way we'll keep our liberty. Well, so here's the deal. I'll reiterate this in a moment or two, but every single office holder takes an oath to uphold the Constitution. And so when something comes before the Senate, let's say, they must not do what Orrin Hatch used to always say, well, let's just pass it and see what the courts do with it. Okay, why would he do? Well, dang, he's a he's a lawyer. He's got this abundance of pride in his priestcraft that he's been practicing, okay? So he's always there saying, the courts will take care of this. See, Warren wanted to be on the Supreme Court but never made it. But the point is that the legislators need to stand up and look at everything that comes before them in light of the limits and bounds established by the Constitution. The president does too. And if the president, just go back for a moment, a couple months ago, we did the Article 2 of the Constitution. That's the president's job description. And Ronald Reagan was famous for thundering from the pulpit, "Give me the line item veto." And all the conservatives would faint and bow down and scrape on the ground and everything else like that. But it would have made him a supra legislator. It would have made him the lord and master of everything that came through. Because they could have, let's just take a bill, one bill, a simple idea. The bill is going to do funding for the nation. And let's say the domestic program's got a 15% increase and the defense program's got a 15% increase. With line item veto, the president could cross through the defense 15% increases, say this is what we're going to do, and sign it, and it's done. That can't be good. There's a separation of powers, and there's pushback everywhere. So the president can't have line item veto and become a super legislator. And the president, well, boy, next time we get together, we're going to talk about some of what those that want a convention want to do. And they want to go back to those kind of ideas. Unfortunately, we won't talk about it right now. Everybody, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, have got to look at everything through that lens of the oath to uphold the Constitution. And they cannot take liberties with that and keep their oath of office. They do it all the time, but they're not keeping their oath of office. So let's go to James Madison. He wanted everybody to jealously protect the powers that were in their office. And so it's interesting if you read Madison. He's an interesting character. He's a little bit of a guy, little bit of a guy. And brilliant, huge mind. I mean, he was Goliath in mind and in body, he was a little guy. That doesn't detract from him, but the point of the matter is that when he was a legislator, he was rabid about the legislative perspective of things. When he was president, he was rabid about that. And so he's an interesting read. But he was absolutely convinced that unless everybody upheld their end of the bargain, their oath of office, unlike Orrin Hatch saying, well, let's just pass it and see what the courts do with it. And he said, no, you can't do that because everything gets skewed if that's the case. And so we've got to jealously guard. So let's read a few things that James Madison said. The accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary or self-appointed or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. So he said, I don't care who you are. Did you inherit your office? Did you get elected to the office? Or did you just usurp your power? Whatever, however you got there, you can't do this. It'll be tyranny if you do it. And that's kind of where the king was. You know, they say, oh, the British, I don't know, their Bill of Rights and all of their safeguards of liberty, it was a kind of an evolving constitution. We have a written one. It's written in plain English, in English words that had meaning. Those words can only mean what they meant when they were written. And you cannot say over time we've changed their definitions. So anyway, he says, keep your hands off of my business. Keep your hands in your arms and hands in the car. Have fun, be careful. Okay, whatever. But you cannot, if you're president, and this is what the president does, by the way, now. He doesn't have line item veto, but the president will have a signing statement. Oftentimes they'll have a little signing in the Rose Garden or something like that, and they'll say, I hereby sign this, and I'm so congratulatory of everything the Congress has done, blah, 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 and here's how I'm going to enforce it. And he leaves things off when he talks about that. You can't. He's got a constitutional responsibility to carry out the laws as passed. He is preventative. He's not creative. He cannot create a different bill. He can't apply it differently. This is how it is passed. So we have a lot of problems because people, they beat around the bush and they get around the, they go around the long way, but they get what they want. And we're going to read some quotations here in a few moments by Jefferson, in which he says, no, we're going to live this Constitution the way it was written, by the way the people understood it in the day it was written. Okay, we'll read those in a few minutes. But he's saying if you accumulate power, this is Madison, if you accumulate powers, you're going to be tyranny. You're going to be a tyranny. Okay, and that's just the way it is. Going on with another Madison statement. This is out of the Federalist 51. Now, the previous one was 47. But the great security against a gradual concentration of the several powers in the same department consists in giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachments of the others. So you got a constitution behind you, you're motivated, and you're going to say over my dead body, you ain't coming in here. You're not going to be the president that creates law with executive orders. That's my job in the legislative. Article 1, Section 1. All legislative authority is found where? In the House and Senate. Okay. Constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachments of the others. The provision for defense must in this, as in all other cases, be made commensurate with the danger of attack. So your fortifications have got to be prepared in accordance with how much is going to be attacked. We're going on with this quotation. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. It's the nature and disposition of almost all men, as soon as they get a little authority as they suppose, to begin to exercise unrighteous dominion. They take power and they begin to abuse it. 1701, I believe it was, Daniel Defoe wrote, all men would be tyrants if they could. And 100 years after the Constitution Convention, Lord Acton said, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Thinking people have always known that this is the nature and disposition of mankind. It's human nature. That's what a constitution is written for, to control the human nature. It's to contain and keep those in power from overstepping that. And that's, by definition, what a constitution is. Limits and bounds. Okay, must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. It may be a reflection on human nature. Oh, there is human nature. How about that? That's what they had well in mind when they were writing this. That such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all the reflections on human nature? So he's saying inherent in government is this nature and disposition to go in and grab power and then try and run with it. Okay, so let's go on with this matter of judicial supremacy for a minute. Well, a few minutes. Most of it's going to be taken from Thomas Jefferson's writings throughout his life. So we need to understand that Jefferson was a constructionist of the Constitution. Well, we'll let him speak for himself. Here's what he said, original intent. The Constitution on which our Union rests shall be administered by me according to the safe and honest meaning contemplated by the plain understanding of the people of the United States at the time of its adoption, a meaning to be found in the explanations of those who advocated, not those who opposed it. These explanations are preserved in the publications of the time. Well, where are they? Well, let's go back and look at the Federalist Papers, for example. Okay. Now, the Anti-Federalist Papers, I love them. I'm glad they're there. I'm glad they were written. I'm glad they pushed back. Because of their interest in expressing concerns about what they thought might happen under the Constitution, we got little innocent bylines like, the Bill of Rights. Okay? That's a really important thing. And you look at what has happened in spite of the fact we've got the Bill of Rights. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. 25,000 laws in the United States now that infringe the right to keep and bear arms? Yeah. I mean, this kind of thing is absolutely abominable. The Patriot Act, 2001, eviscerated, erased, expunged the Fourth Amendment. Okay? And, well, we don't need to go through all of them. I often say, though, when people say they ask me how many of the Bill of Rights are being violated, I say all of them. Oh, well, maybe except for the Third Amendment. What one's that? The quartering of troops. The British troops were put in the homes of the people they say, well, we're here to protect you. Yeah. You're really here to protect me. And you got 7 guys living in my living room with muskets and bayonets and they're abusing the women and the children, they're breaking the furniture up or whatever, okay? But they were there to control the people. And so the American Founding Fathers got really offended by that. Can't quarter troops. And I always used to say, well, that's not being violated yet, but I'm not so sure. And here's why I say that. Because by hook and by crook, they have bought the hearts and minds of the military and police officers within our own communities. They set out, oh, you need new cars in the police department? We'll write you a grant for that. Better armor? Your wish is our command. How about better firearms? And okay, we'll do that. How about an MRAP? You guys want an MRAP? That's a mine-resistant, ambush-protected 60-ton vehicle that drives through houses, okay? They're for combat zones. And the little community up by us, 30 miles out of town from us, a little farming community, has an MRAP. I said, well, what are they going to do when the farmers come in after a good harvest and get a little bit tipsy on the bars and get a little bit happy? Are you going to drive over them with these MRAP? What are you going to need these for? But they're there. Anyway, so I believe that we have officers that are being planted, or their hearts and minds are being, if you will, tainted by their buying in on the influence of some other foreign powers, okay? Anyway, so, yes, the publications of the time, which is the last couple of lines, read the Anti-Federalist Papers. But they were not trying to clarify what the Constitution said. They were pointing out how it might be abused. So they can't be used as a clarion call for how it ought to be abided by. They were just saying somebody's going to screw up on this. The Federalist Papers, on the other hand, were written to try and explain what was meant in the debates of the Founding Fathers in the Convention. And so there's a difference. But you get the View of the Constitution by St. George Tucker, magnificent book. But I think you ought to, first of all, read the Federalist Papers, then you ought to read the inaugural addresses, then the farewell addresses. And once you've become kind of immersed in the language of the founders, then read View of the Constitution of the United States by St. George Tucker. I tell people about, oh, they write it down. I'm going to order this thing. I had a young man, he was probably 38 or 40 years old. He's a young man, okay? So all of you guys that are young, just remember that. That's my perspective. Okay. Yeah, you're younger than my kids. So just, anyway, I always tell people, read those other things first. You know, kind of temper yourselves with the language. There's an eloquence there. One of my friends 35 years ago had a literary software, I don't know what you'd call it, but you'd feed in the words of a book, and they'd say, oh, it's written at the 7th grade level. You know, that's what most newspapers are. What 7th grade level anymore? I don't know. Cartoons. But at any rate, he put in the Federalist Papers, and it came out 32nd grade. I mean, when I was working on my master's degree, we had to read 4, I think, Federalist Papers. And the students in the class said it was the most difficult reading they'd ever had. I thought it was high literary magnificence, you know. My biggest complaint in the Federalist Papers is they're not long enough. The 85 essays is only this thick. But at any rate, but then once you've got all of these things down and you feel comfortable and you're, the words of the founders, you know, they wear on you good. Then read View of the Constitution of the United States by Tucker. Anyway, this individual I was telling you about, that was probably 40 years old when I told him, read these things, then read View. He ordered View and he opened it first. Okay. I got a call about a week later. He says, I got the book. I says, great. What do you think about it? And he says, I've got a sentence here that's 54 words long. What does it mean? And I says, have you read the other stuff first? And he says, no. I says, go read that and then call me back. So anyway, that's what I say. And I got a sidetrack there. But the publications of the time are very explicit. If you love the founding of this nation and the baseline principles, the limits and bounds, checks and balances, separation of powers, all that kind of stuff, you'll be cheering all the way through St. George Tucker's book. But they're preserved in the publications of the time, as Jefferson said. Going on, he said, on every question of construction, that's how we put this together, you know, we construct a house, we construct the a form of government. He said, let us carry ourselves back to the time when the Constitution was adopted. Recollect the spirit manifested in the debates, and instead of trying what meaning may be squeezed out of the text or inventing against it, conform to the probable one in which it was passed. So use your common sense, folks. It's written in plain English. Again, those words can only mean what they meant in the day they were written. Republic doesn't mean democracy. It says republic. Hopefully by the end of this evening, we'll get to republics a little bit. So he says, use your common sense when you're reading it. He went on to say, these are at different times that he wrote about these things. Laws, this is an interesting one. If any of you, I read quite a number of proposed laws in the Utah legislature every time they're in session. I guarantee your lives, liberties, and properties are at risk during the Utah legislative session. But I read a number of them in that are at the general level, the federal level also. And they are just a hodgepodge of legal mumbo jumbo in many instances, sometimes thousands of pages long. Okay, it's a tragic travesty. Jefferson had a different perspective. In fact, when he wrote or helped write things like the Coinage Act of 1792, they wanted things to be done, weights and measures. They wanted them things that people did not have to run to Washington with a stick and measure it against a foot, and then take it back out to their farm in Kentucky. These were things people should be able to grasp fairly quickly and easily. So he wanted us common folk to be able to understand them. He wrote, laws are made for men of ordinary understanding and should therefore be construed by the ordinary rules of common sense. Their meaning is not to be sought for in metaphysical subtleties, the ether out there someplace, which may make anything mean everything or nothing at pleasure. It means, no, it means nothing. Oh, no, it means everything. Well, what did it mean in the plain English words, okay? Those were his thoughts, okay? And then in this one, we're getting on to judicial review in this particular statement. See, there was judicial review that was happening, and the judges were saying, we got the final say on things. Jefferson was really concerned about that because the legislators should have the final say in their realm. The president should have the final say in his realm. The legislators and the executive should say, I ain't signing this. I'm not buying into this. We're not going to pass it and see what the courts do. We are going to judge it based upon its constitutional merits ourselves. And if the people in the legislative mess up and get something through that should not be, the president needs to say, I ain't signing this. I'm vetoing this, and I'm sending it back according to Article 1, Section 7 of the Constitution. These are the reasons I'm not signing it. I'm vetoing it. And they come up with their valid reasons. It violates this portion of the Constitution or whatever. So, in Jefferson's administration, there started to be Marbury versus Madison, for example, happened during that time. And largely it was based on some sound principles. But here's what everybody takes away from that one is, no. The judicial overrides anything else that anybody else does. But what was being said in it was, I can't force Madison to do these things because he's in his own realm and I can't override that. But it was judged to be in everybody's mind, oh no, this says that the Supreme Court is supreme. So anyway, let's look at some of the things that Jefferson says. See if it makes any sense, if it rings true, if there's a kind of a feeling that this is a common sense approach to things. He said, our judges are as honest as other men and not more so. They have with others the same passions, plural, for party, for power, and the privilege of their core. Now, if they don't, what are they, eunuchs that don't have any body parts or passions? I don't know. But they have the same passions for party. Sotomayor, Judge Roberts, these people are not on opposite sides very often, okay, because they have this arrogance of office, I think. For a party, for power, privilege of their core, and their power is the more dangerous as they are in office for life and not responsible as other functionaries are to the elective control. He misstated a little bit there. They're left in office during good behavior, aren't they? Okay, we read that last time we were together. Okay, so they get in office, and as long as they're in good behavior, they can stay there. By the way, John Jay was the first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. He resigned after a short period of time and says, I got other things to do. These guys hang on to it as if it is the office of authority and power in all eternity. It's not. Okay, going on with Jefferson. The Constitution has erected no such single tribunal, knowing to whatever hands confided with the corruptions of time and party, its members would become despots. It has more wisely made all the departments co-equal and co-sovereign within themselves. Go read the Constitution. You don't see a supremacy clause in there. We're going to talk later, not tonight, but about the supreme law of the land and what it really means. It means supreme in its realm, basically. That's about as succinct and brief as I can put it. But they can't tell you, let's see, I'm looking for shoelaces. Nobody wears shoelaces anymore. There's some. Okay, you got black shoelaces, so do you. What color are yours? Oh, does any law say you got to have a certain color shoelace? No, because there's nobody that has authority to direct that. No supreme law of the land can tell you what color shoelace you're going to wear, okay? And I use that as a stupid rule. How many kids you're going to have, whether you want a pink roof or a blue roof, whether you want what color carpet, a chain link fence, a picket fence. It's not supreme, but we'll get to that when we get to that in another get-together. Okay, its members would become despots. It has more wisely made all the departments co-equal and co-sovereign within themselves. The Constitution, in keeping three departments and independent, restrains the authority of the judges to judiciary organs as it does the executive and legislative to executive and legislative organs. So you guys have a role, play it, do it. When the legislative or executive functionaries act unconstitutionally, have they ever done that? Yes, they most certainly have. And in fact, I'll just point out, this is maybe going to date this presentation for if it's on tape a little bit, but you're all aware of the pistol brace things that the BATFE, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, decided after decades of saying this little brace you put on your arm to shoot your pistol does not make it a rifle. They've suddenly decided it makes a rifle, and subject to the National Firearms Act. And so you've got to pay all your fees, you've got to go through all the nosebleed, all of the bureaucratic rigmarole to have one of these little things you strap on your pistol and on your arm. It's not a long and a rifle with a short barrel. It's not. Okay, but what's happening is that the BATFE said it is, after decades of saying it's not. And they made a law that says you can't have it or you're a criminal. Probably 250,000 Americans are criminals right now because of the fact that they are not registering, going through the bureaucratic nightmare of doing that. But the courts, in every case that's so far been ruled on, have said, you're overstepping your bounds. The BATFE is part of the executive department. The executive is creating law. And the legislative could not delegate to the executive branch the authority to create law under the BATFE. Anyway, so this cycle of things, so when the executive acts unconstitutionally, they're responsible to the people in their elected capacity. Why the heck don't we remove them from office when their people do stuff like that? The exemption of judges from that is elections, is quite dangerous enough. I know of no safe depository of the ultimate powers of the society but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion by education. That's what we've been trying for the last 50 years to do, at least in my life, is to help people understand the limits and bounds that is established by this contract that was made with the United States and the people of the United States on how the government would be functioning. Okay. Going on with Jefferson. This is the true corrective of abuses of constitutional power. If the three powers maintain their mutual independence, legislative, executive, and judicial, mutual independence of each other, the government may last long, but not so if either can assume the authorities of the others. Okay? So that's where we are right now. Everybody is a jumble on this whole thing, and nobody's pushing back. We don't have a James Madison in there to say over my dead body, or a Thomas Jefferson or whatever, not on my watch. We have a bunch of go along to get along, mamby-pamby individuals that are absolutely, they're in violation of their oath of office. They are supposed to push back. That's their charge. Okay. Going on with another segment and some other letters that he put out. I just do a few selected ones when I present. You know, time is constraint, but there's enough to make the point, I think. So he says it's a fallacious doctrine of judicial supremacy. Quoting again now. This is to John Adams' wife. And by the way, Abigail Adams was equally yoked with a brilliant husband. She was an amazing companion. And both of them, I think, deserved each other royally. So just a second. Okay. Been through the desert on a horse with no name. You probably don't even remember that song, but anyway, you get mighty dry in the desert, don't you? You can remember your name anyway. Especially on a horse. I'm not gonna, my wife thought it said a horse with no legs when she was young. But, you know, sometimes they get a little jumbled when they hear things. But I don't want to get off, and I'm not going to sing it for anybody because I don't sing and I don't dance. But at any rate, so okay, that's right. Abigail and John deserved one another, and they are both brilliant in their own right. And as you note the date on the bottom of this, this is a letter to Thomas Jefferson to Abigail in 1804. Thomas Jefferson was in the presidency. He had just kicked the butt of John Adams out of that office. I mean, he hadn't literally done that, okay, so don't get the impression. John Adams and him had been rabid political enemies during Washington's presidency and Jefferson's presidency because Jefferson was the vice president of Adams. That's the way the Electoral College worked in those days. So they politically hated each other's guts. They'd been magnificent friends. And there were cohorts in establishing this nation, 1776. They were on the committee that put together the Declaration of Independence. And they loved each other like brothers. Okay, well, they fell out of favor with each other for a period of time. Abigail continued to correspond with Thomas Jefferson. And you think, well, what's this married woman writing to this guy? But no, it wasn't that. It was an exchange of ideas. And it was brilliant. The reason I got off on this little tangent is if you ever get a chance, you need to read the reconciliation letters that took place between Jefferson and Adams, not Abigail, but John. Both of them had finished their presidency. Both of them were encouraged by Abigail. She's saying, you know, John, you and Thomas used to get along pretty good. Why don't you guys strike up a little, pen pal job? And then she'd write to Thomas and back and forth. She finally prevailed, and their reconciliation letters are insights into some of the most brilliant minds that were there at the founding of this nation. And I just love their letters. Their exchanges are just Thomas Jefferson, smooth and genteel, the Southern gentleman that he was. Tell you to take a long walk on a short pier, and that people say, he wanted me to have a good journey. And if John Adams says, have a good day, they say, oh, man, he just told me to go to hell. He was so sharp and crisp and kind of blunt that people, but they were so synergistic in their love of liberty. Anyway, so the letter we're reading right now is from Thomas to Abigail during Thomas's presidency. John was still adamant against him. Thomas wrote, the Constitution meant that its coordinate branches should be checks on each other, but the opinion which gives the judges the right to decide what laws are constitutional and what not only for themselves in their own sphere of action, but also for the legislature and executive also in their spheres, would make the judiciary a despotic branch. So when we started this here this time, we brought up the Brunson Supreme Court case, which was a holdover from last month's topic. In absolute, total truth, had that been ruled in favor of what they were asking for, the judiciary would have been the despotic branch. 5 judges, might have been 6, might have been 8. I don't know how many would have ruled in favor of it, but if they got at least 5, it would have completely eviscerated the general government. Legislative branch would have been shut down. I think 388 people were supposed to be booted, okay? And the entire executive branch, you know, whether it's Biden or Kamala, everybody, gone, all elected officials. And those judges, as few as 5, could have said, we are Lord and King of this nation. Would have been wrong all the way around. But anyway, that's what this supremacy clause does for the judges. Think back to 1973, those of you that are old enough to remember 1973. They said it's okay to kill babies before they're born. That had been wrong for all of mortality. And it was based upon the Holy Scriptures. And so here they did, they turned it upside down. The late 1850s, the Dred Scott decision. Black people can never be citizens of the United States. Really? Are you kidding me? I mean, that was the definitive ruling that they were looking for to get rid of this slavery issue. Holy cow. These people, when they're wrong, are absolutely, completely dead last wrong. The Reed v. Covert decision, 1956, the Supreme Court realized almost instantly that they had really screwed up. So they asked that that case be brought back before them. It was argued by the same attorney that had lost before them before, and they overturned themselves. They knew they were wrong, and they were wrong big time. Okay, so stuff like that happens. But if the judiciary is considered only and finally the last word, they can become despots, and they have become in many instances. Okay, so here's another statement he made a few years later. The question whether the judges are invested with exclusive authority to decide on the constitutionality of a law has been heretofore a subject of consideration with me in the exercise of official duties. So this is after his presidency. He's had a long time to reflect on this. He says, yeah, I've been thinking about this. Certainly there is not a word in the Constitution which has given that power to them more than to the executive or legislative branches. So this is being gathered constantly by the attorneys that are in office, whether they're an executive or they're a legislator, or obviously they're in the judiciary. We're pushing the power to that branch. It's wrong. Okay, so let's go on. Another writing even after that one. In denying the right, the Supreme Court usurps, of exclusively explaining the Constitution, then indeed is our Constitution a complete act of suicide. Because if 5 black-robed judges, unelected, that get in that office, and that, by the way, that is the Constitution is what the Supreme Court says it is. That's an aphorism in the nation today. And that is why a Supreme Court justice being confirmed becomes such an acrimonious act. There's tooth and nail fights going on. They will Coke cans and whatever, you know, I mean, we don't need to go down some of that pathway. But the fact of the matter is the efforts to derail someone that's opposite of your belief system is absolutely rabid. And by the way, just as a little side note, if I forget to mention it in Article 5 when we get there next month, those that want to do a constitutional convention want to put Supreme Court justices on a rotating term limits situation, because they believe that if they can change the dynamic of the belief system of the court, and they can do that quicker by putting it on a rotating system, they're doing a pretty good job of it right now, they're going to ultimately and finally be able to capture that entire arm of the general government, unelected, for life, and they'll think that with that definition of the Constitution is what the Supreme Court says it is, they can rule any way they darn well please. What do they need a legislature for, or an executive? They just say, yea, verily, thus saith the Lord, and it is, okay? That's not what they are. Okay. An act of suicide. For intending to establish 3 departments, coordinate and independent, that they might check and balance one another, it has given, according to this opinion, to one of them alone the right to prescribe rules for the government of the others. And to that one, too, it is unelected by and independent of the nation. The Constitution on this hypothesis is a mere thing of wax in the hands of the judiciary, which they may twist and shape into any form they please. And that's how they're trying to reshape this entire nation. Okay, don't get me wrong. This isn't the only effort that's being made. It's being made at all levels, from your lowest municipality to the highest levels of government, throughout the executive branch, throughout the parties, et cetera, et cetera. But this is one of the principal methodologies, and Joe Biden has floated it's a lead balloon at this point, idea of basically packing the court with his type of people, like FDR tried to do. FDR lost a lot of House seats the year he tried to do that, and he backed off on. Joe Biden, I don't think, has the brain power at this point to know he ought to back off, but at any rate. Okay, a year later after that last one. He says, to consider the judges as the ultimate arbiters of all constitutional questions is a very dangerous doctrine indeed, and one which would place us under the despotism of an oligarchy. We're talking about an oligarchy that could have taken this nation over had that Supreme Court decision gone the way probably 98% of the patriots hoped it would. There were a few of us that spoke against it, and man, I'd been sworn at a lot by people that I thought were my friends. At any rate, we can't turn this over to that kind of nonsense. Okay, so we need to remember there's an oath that the president takes in Article 2, Section 1. I remember when I was young, I listened to John F. Kennedy probably give this 100 times. And unless you think I was a Kennedy acolyte, I wasn't. They coined the term Camelot after John F. Kennedy's death. It wasn't Camelot. I remember those years very well. But there was a charisma, there was a feeling, there was an enthusiasm, there was a passion. Part of it was probably intimate, and some of it was for government and bigger government and everything. Kennedy's desire to reshape the government of the United States was real but unsuccessful. LBJ got to shape it in the name of our fallen hero. So after Kennedy was dead, he rode on those coattails to get a lot of his nonsense passed. But I listened to John F. Kennedy give this probably at least 100 times when I was young. And it struck me, the resonance of this oath is important. So maybe that's part of what I can attribute some of my enthusiasm and passion for this nation to. After that time, I left home and traveled the country when I was 16. When I was a teenager, I traveled from Florida to Alaska and New York to California, boots on the ground. I had seen this country, its people. I could tell you stories all evening about the greatness of this nation, the love I have for the people. People I know, I mean, I'll maybe meet them again in the hereafter, and I'll maybe remember him even, I don't know, but these are great Americans, just common, dirt farmers. I helped build a church in a little community I rolled into a little town in kind of north central Mississippi one night, probably about 10, 11 o'clock. I'd heard they were building a church. And I went to a home there, and I says, I understand your folks are building a church. I'm wondering if I could help you. And they says, yeah, come on in. Too dark to go pound nails right now, but they kicked one of their kids out of their bed, and they let me sleep in their bed, and they gave me a magnificent breakfast. We went over, I pounded nails over there, and I got up some of the tall stuff in the tower that most of the people didn't want to get into. I tell you these stories, I don't know why, but just to tell you the greatness, the goodness of Americans. And I was with a buddy of mine, and he says, are these people family? I says, what do you mean? He says, they're treating you like royalty. I said, I don't know, they're just good people, kind of thing. when I left that town, I don't even know where it is. I got in one dark Mississippi night and I left probably another dark Mississippi night. I don't even know where I went to. But the point of the matter is, these are the kind of people America's made out of. And I trust and I love them. But the fact of the matter is that this part of it shaped some of my youth, I think. Here's the oath the president takes. Before he enter on this is right out of Article 2, Section 1. Before he enter on the execution of his office, he shall take the following oath or affirmation, quoting, I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Very simple, very straightforward oath of office. The president should be held to that. It's an impeachment offense if they violate that, in my opinion. This idea, later on, we get into the thing about them carefully fulfilling the laws of the nation. Well, this isn't happening. We've had, in the last few years, 10 million illegals break into our country. And it's really amazing, at least 10 million we know of. He's not fulfilling the laws that were created by the Congress, and he's letting it happen. And it's a violation. And I've mentioned this maybe before, and I don't need to belabor it, but June 6, 1944, 160,000 invaded Europe, D-Day. They weren't going home till their job was done. We have that happen certainly about every 2 weeks now. It's a D-Day invasion, kids, and we've got 10 millions at least that have come in during the last few years. A lot of them, obviously, and maybe not so obviously to a lot of people, but they're young military-age men of countries of origin that are not our friends. And I say, holy cow. Faithfully execute the office of president to the best of his ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. It ain't happening. That's an impeachable offense. Okay, let's go over to Article 6, where it says all that hold office have got to take an oath. It says the senators and representatives, before mentioned. Now, we could talk about another one that's a Republican, Mike Johnson, and what he's doing behind the scenes to unconstitutionally spend money right now for military support of the Ukraine and Israel. Now, I don't know about you guys if you've ever really recognized this, but we don't have an extra nickel in this country. About every 100, 150 days, we go another $1 trillion in debt. We're bleeding ourselves white or dry or however you want to call it. And we're going to give billions of dollars, an unconstitutional, collected from the American taxpayer or printed in the Federal Reserve, to foreign countries in military aid. We're the largest exporter of death and destruction on the earth. And so we're going to do that. And Mike Johnson's negotiating behind the scenes with Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden to do this. And he's told us, he's promised us just this week, it'll happen in the next week or two. No, we don't have the money. There's no authorization for this to happen. And you're going to do it. That's what got Kevin McCarthy booted from office. It should happen again. And I don't believe, as some people say, that maybe Mike Johnson's being blackmailed. No, he's not. He came into office with this intention. And the day he was put in office, I said, it happened too easy. This guy has an agenda. It's going to happen. Well, we're watching it right before our eyes. Nevertheless, senators and representatives before mentioned, the members of the several state legislatures, and all executive and judicial officers, are they all inclusive in this? Okay. Both of the United States and of the several states shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution, but no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. We're going to talk a little bit more about Article 6 in the future. Everybody has to take an oath, no matter what your office is. So the legislators and the judges all take that same oath. Well, it's a little different, and when we get into this Article 6, I'm going to show you the difference in some of the oaths that they take. But I took an oath to uphold the Constitution when I was 18 years old. I went in the service. it doesn't have an expiration date. It's different now for those that go in than it was 55 years ago. Okay? But nonetheless, it's an oath to uphold the Constitution. And that I can't walk away from it. I simply can't. Okay, so we've covered the judicial branch now pretty much. I was going to say, okay, next time we're going to do this. We're going to do Article 4. We got another hour. We're going to talk about full faith and credit. We're going to talk the state-to-state citizens' right. We're going to talk about bringing new states into the Union. We're going to talk about U.S. property disposal, states as republics, protecting states from invasion, and why the naturalization process is controlled by the general government. Okay, all of these things we're going to cram into an hour. Okay, so what I'm going to do is jump over to this other presentation. I'm going to jump out of this and completely. And then, if the magic of technology works well, we're going to be there. How about that, sports fans? Okay. So this is that presentation that we hoped to start with this evening, but which will be truncated based upon my untimely demise in an hour. So, no DiMaggio? No, okay, no, that's what you said. It's not Joe DiMaggio. Okay, never mind. There's a long story with that one too, for those of you that might be interested, but I won't tell it now. Okay, Article 4, Section 1 states, in quotes, full faith and credit shall be given in each state to the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state. We're going to deconstruct these a little bit after each statement. And the Congress may by general laws prescribe the manner in which such acts, records, and proceedings shall be proved and the effect thereof. What the heck and why? Okay, well, there's some very good reasons behind that. Okay, let's kind of deconstruct it a little bit. So, my wife and I were married in California 50 years ago. Okay, and for some reason, she still hangs around me. I don't know what the deal is, but we were married in California. Every state we have moved to, and we've lived basically from coast to coast, and many states in between, has recognized our marriage. I mean, we had a California marriage license. We've never had to show it to anybody, have we? Don't think so. Oh, maybe when you changed some of your name and stuff like that on driver's licenses. But at any rate, yeah, all the states, it's not an issue. We're married. We go live in New Jersey for a while, sure, you guys are married. You got kids, that's okay, you're married. I mean, whatever. Doesn't matter so much anymore, but the fact of the matter is, they recognize those actions of a state, those official actions, as authenticated. And you don't have to go through the process of getting married again. Now, again, I could talk at length about why the heck should government be involved in any decisions about two people getting together and being married. It's between you and God and all that kind of stuff. But if this is just a point of discussion, my driver's license is good in Montana or Florida or California or New Mexico, wherever. Haven't found a state yet where they question my driver license. Okay? There's a lot of other things. There's some caveats that are being thrown in now in contravention to this. My concealed carry permit does not transfer to California. My instructor permit doesn't transfer to teaching Colorado's concealed carry stuff for handguns, okay? So there are some things that are being blunted right now. But nonetheless, basically the concept and the intent was that these legal acts that happen are recognized across. I wish there were time. In fact, I did at one point. It was in fact under Article 3, last time we got together, where I talked about a legislative enactment that would clarify the limits and bounds of the courts to rule on some things. It could be same-sex marriage, it could be abortion or whatever, and how that could be done and carried out, and how this act, I mean, this particular portion of the Constitution could be still qualified under that. However, we did that a month ago and we're not going to do it again, at least right now, maybe someday if you're interested. But So you recognize the acts from one state to the next. And court findings in one state is recognized in other states. So let's say there's a divorce decree that says you got to owe $1,000 a kid for the rest of their life until they're 18 or whatever. And then you move to another state. Gone, toast. Nobody needs to worry about this. Well, this child support thing travels with you. and so states recognize that kind of. These are just little examples I thought I'd throw in. This is kind of a nationalizing clause in the Constitution. Because if you couldn't do these things, again, we've talked, and we're going to do just a little bit towards the end of this presentation. It's in Federalist 39, and it's also in St. George Tucker's view of the Constitution. The idea is that this is a national constitution, but it's also a federal constitution. The national part meaning that there's some supremacy things in there, meaning that, okay, let's take one thing supreme. Only the national government, general government, federal government, however you denominate it, can negotiate treaties between nations. And Article 1, Section 10 specifically says you cannot have a state negotiate a treaty or an agreement with another nation. And there's a lot of good reasons for that. Like, for example, Georgia could have decided they were going to negotiate a treaty with France, and then together they'd go to war against England, because England and France were always doing that. But that wouldn't work out too good for the rest of the country. An American ship attacked our ship. Did they say, oh, wait a minute. Oh, that was a Georgian flag. We're only going to go to war against Georgia. No, America would be at war if that were the case. So there are national aspects of it that they take precedent in every instance. And this idea of nationalizing is if, for example, you couldn't go between states and your marriage license didn't work, or your driver license didn't work, and they shouldn't have them anyway, but this idea of a court decree about child support that I used as an example, it'd be like going to another country every time you left and went to another state. So they were trying to bind the nation together and say, we are really one nation. And these are some of the binding clauses, if you will. So this clause is a nationalization clause that said, we are going to recognize these acts. Okay, and that was a good thing for the nation. By the way, we're not going to do a comprehensive review, I don't think, unless I get asked to at another point. If you're ever interested, we could do a point-by-point discussion of the Articles of Confederation with the U.S. Constitution. We're going to have a few examples this evening as we're together to show you how different they were, and there's a lot of similarities too. But the Articles of Confederation had some similarity to this particular thing because they were trying to bind the nation together. Not as well as this did, though. Okay, so let's go to Article 4, Section 2, Clause 1. Quoting, the citizens of each state shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states. Okay, let's go talk about that. So the states couldn't put their citizens in a favorable position over another state. You weren't a second-class citizen because you went to Idaho for the weekend, okay? I mean, they weren't going to automatically, give you a ticket or something like that, or say, crossing the state line costs money or anything like that. Everybody's supposed to be equal before the law. That is an Americanist philosophy that is being violated constantly now. But what about this idea of state tuition for schools and versus non-resident or hunting licenses? Okay, now this seems to be an exception, if you will, but the logic behind it is, okay, we have state schools, state, is funding the schools. We have, even in your local municipalities, our community has opted for in recent times, tens and tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars to build additional schools, largely because of our sanctuary status as the state of Utah and what we've done with our influx of those that are illegal, but that's another story too. But we are paying that. It has been added on to my property tax. And if I don't pay, they seize my home, even though it's been paid for decades, okay? They take these things and they take them seriously. They remove my property. So the idea of state tuition versus non-state tuition, non-resident tuition, and hunting licenses for the maintenance of the elk herd or whatever they're doing, they say, no, these people in the state are paying for that, so it's reasonable to expect that people that are coming here to hunt their elk or that want to go to college at a state university have to pay a higher tuition. Okay, so that's been what would appear to be an exception of this, but by and large, everybody's supposed to get equal protection before the law. But what it is all God-given rights are preserved. So life, liberty, property, trade and commerce, habeas corpus, taxes, passage meaning being able to go through the state without being hit with some kind of a fee to get through the state. All of those things are part of being treated equally among the states. Again, this is a part of the nationalization thing. I'm going to take a few minutes. Some of you have maybe heard me talk about this in the past. Federalist 42 is a very interesting Federalist paper. It's a very broad and deep paper. And there's the subject matter is very important. Some of my libertarian friends, and by the way, they are very close to us in so many ways, but they say, first of all, naturalization, citizenship, it doesn't matter. Open borders, let's just do it. And others say, no, each state can set their own rules, okay? But remember, the full faith and credit of every state is offered to everybody else in terms of what happens. So one of the things that James Madison talks about in the Federalist 42 is this idea about citizenship and naturalization, why it cannot be an open-ended thing. There has to be shall we say, a rule and a guide on this whole thing, okay? So he goes back and he says, holy cow, under the Articles of Confederation, whew, we dodged a bullet on this one. I mean, that's kind of how, he doesn't quite say it that way. He says the dissimilarity of the rules of naturalization has long been remarked as a fault in our Articles of Confederation system, as laying a foundation for intricate and delicate questions. And he's going to kind of review some of those. Those who come under the denomination of free inhabitants of a state, but this is some of the terminology taken out of the Articles, though not citizens of such a state, are entitled in every other state to the privileges of free citizens of the latter. That is, to greater privileges than they may be entitled in their own state. So he's saying, basically, let me kind of give you an overview. If one state accepts you and you get all the privileges, you get them everywhere, okay? And think about this for a minute. If there were to be an authorization for you to come into Georgia, let's say, because there were only 13 states at the time, if you came into Georgia and all you had to do was breathe on a mirror and it fogged and you were a citizen, but in New York, you had to have 5 years of residency and you had to show gainful employment and you had to be showing that you were not a ward of the state and all this other stuff. What was anybody going to do? They were going to come to Georgia, get citizenship, move to New York. I got my citizenship. Where'd you get yours? Okay, so you can see they're entitled to these privileges as they move from state to state. So where are they going to immigrate to? Georgia. Where are they going to move to? Where the big economy is in New York, okay? So this is basically where he's going with this. So that it may be in the power of the particular state, or rather every state, is laid under a necessity not only to confer the rights of citizenship in other states upon any whom it may admit to such rights within itself, but upon any whom it may allow to become inhabitants within its jurisdiction. So they're saying Georgia's got the lowest common denominator for people who want to come here and get a citizenship. They're forcing that upon New York, in the example I used. Because they set it so low, New York has to accept that low standard, okay? The very improper power would still be retained by each state of naturalizing aliens in every other state. In one state, residence for a short term confers all the rights of citizenship. In another, qualifications of greater importance are required. An alien, therefore, legally incapacitated for certain rights in the latter may by previous resident only in the former elude his incapacity. So this is the language they're saying. If you come in the lowest common denominator, you've got it in the others. So he took a lot of lines to say that. And thus the law of one state be preposterously rendered paramount, that's above, superior to, the law of another within the jurisdiction of the other. We owe it to mere casualty that very serious embarrassments on this subject have been hitherto escaped. So he's saying, we dodged that bullet. We're going to make this a clarifying statement about it in this Constitution. And the immigration naturalization is a national decision, and Congress will exercise that. Go back and read Article 1, Section 8. Okay, so we covered that one very quickly. All right. We're about 1/12 of the presentation through on this one, and we've got 45 minutes left. I just want to keep you score with you guys, so you know if I seem like I'm running the table a little bit sometimes, it happens. Okay, Article 4, Section 2, Clause 1, quoting out of the Constitution. A person charged in any state with treason, felony, or other crime, who shall flee from justice and be found in another state, shall, on demand of the executive authority of the state from which he fled, be delivered up and be removed to the state having jurisdiction of the crime. So this has to do with extradition. So here's the little breakdown of that. A state has a right to demand the return of an accused that fled their state. It's called extradition. Okay, they require, if you're going to, and I'm not, this could be several slides to even put bullet points together. Basically, there has to be sworn charges and indictment against the individual. Okay, so this can't be just somebody comes to you and the governor's door and knocks on it and says, I want you to send this guy back to Missouri to do something. You might have heard stories about this. Just because. You have to have sworn statements, and they usually have to be eyewitnesses too. And the governor has to present those to the other governor, okay? So it's charges and an indictment. Okay, so the governors are not supposed to be judge of innocence or guilt. They're supposed to look at the extradition papers and say, have they made a legal claim on this individual? Okay. Was it appropriate? Is it extradition? Is there something that's missing on this thing? But what has been very interesting in this, and it's been through the last couple of centuries, is that the courts have said, governors have a discretionary power in this. So if a governor gets presented with a extradition request, demand, order, whatever you want to call it, and he's pretty sure that what's going to happen is that the individual that's going to be sent back to the other state is going to get lynched when they get back there, he says, I don't think so. I'm not going to do this. And nobody can question the governor's jurisdiction or decision. It is discretionary. There's nobody that can complain and say, I'm taking this to court and we're not going to stand for this. The governor says no, the answer is no. So, okay, I think this is probably a valid issue because some states in the past have been known to be rather hang 'em high, let's put it that way, or shoot first and ask questions later or whatever. And it's become something that if there's a history of people that get across the state line and end up swinging from a tree limb almost immediately, the governor says, I don't think we're going to do this. People can gnash their teeth and be angry and mean and nasty about the whole thing, but that discretionary power is implied in this thing, and it has been exercised, I think, with good cause in many, many different instances. But what is this? It's another check and balance. It's in favor of the accused. It's something that should be said, well, let's look at Julian Assange. Now, I know this is another country he's in right now. Julian Assange should get a full pardon and a medal and probably a pension, okay, for the rest of his life. Now, his life has been dramatically shortened by what's happened, but this accusatory indictment, kind of vicious pursuit of him is happening. It's happening between countries, okay? He's in England right now, and they're trying to get him here, and England's withholding that extradition because they want to get a guarantee from the United States they're not going to kill him. And it's kind of like, did Jeffrey Epstein have that guarantee? He hadn't been convicted. He hadn't even had a trial. There was no appeal going on. There was nothing. By golly, he broke his own throat while he was getting hanged by his own hand, and it's not the way it happened. So anyway, right now England's withholding that, but England should be able to say, you know what? This guy did a great justice to everybody. England right now is trying to have its cake and eat it too. What Julian Assange set forth was a First Amendment right. But the problem is that it put the United States government in a very embarrassing situation. They were basically told, you know, you guys have been doing a lot of things that are really kind of nasty out there in the world, and you've been spying on our allies, and you've been collecting nasty statements, and you've been pulling off really illegal kind of activities in countries where you've been doing all sorts of things. And England should thank us, as should Germany. I mean, think of all of our quote unquote allies where we have been treating them as basically dirt. Anyway, I don't think Assange ought to be brought back into this country, but I think the president should give him a pardon so he can travel and everything else like that he wants to. But that's another side note. But those discretionary powers, you can see how they would be of value if some governor in Missouri was going to hang somebody if they got back across their state line. And the governor in Illinois that was going to, send them back shouldn't have to. Okay, enough said. But the state, if they get these extradition papers, they can go in and capture the person. They can hold them until they get the paperwork done, and then they can deliver them. That's kind of how that works with this extradition thing. This next portion was superseded by the 13th Amendment. And it has to do with slavery. It has to do with the responsibility if a slave escapes out of a slave state, say Georgia, and they get up to Minnesota and they get captured, they've got to return them. Okay, property. That's an interesting thing about people. Okay, so this is about slaves, and they don't say slaves because there was a compulsion on the part of a lot of the northeastern states when this was written to not have slavery written into the Constitution. But, so they considered at that time slaves the property of the owner. It incorporated slaves and bondservants. Slaves not mentioned, as I say. And there's original intent of what the founders intended to abolish slavery, both in Article 1, Section 9 and Federalist Number 42. Federalist Number 42, like I said earlier, has to do with a lot of things about citizenship and why the general government should have control over the awarding of citizenship. But the another thing in Federalist 42 is the intent to get rid of slavery. We talked about this at length in our Article 1 discussion some months ago. Go back in the memory banks and look at it. The Article 1, Section 9, 1808 clause. The intent, and it was clarified in Federalist 42 by Madison, we intend to get rid of slavery. But if we say that and do that up front, the slave states will not ratify the Constitution. The Constitution will never be ratified in the slave states, and consequently, they'll never join the Union. And if they don't join the Union, they can have slavery forever. They may still have it today. So it was a step-by-step domino effect that had to happen. They had to get the Constitution, then they could get the Bill of Rights, then they could, and everything could finally play into final dissolution of the slavery thing. But it was a step-by-step process. So we won't take the time to go through, Federalist 42, because we did that under the first article. And Article 1, Section 9 is also expanded on to some degree. Go back and look at some of that. What I find very interesting is, in spite of what it said in Article 4 about returning slaves, jury nullification happened all the time. That a slave may be in some Northwestern Territory state that gets brought before a judge, and they say, we're gonna have a trial and we're gonna send you back to Georgia. I don't want to pick on Georgia, but that's kind of where stuff was happening. And what did the jury do? We ain't gonna do it. The jury's nullified. They turned the person free, and they were free. And it probably cost Daniel Webster the presidency, because there was a real tussle over this kind of stuff. But in spite of the fact it said it in the Constitution, juries were saying no. We could do that again today in a lot of things. Well, the 13th Amendment made it all obsolete right after the so-called Civil War. Here's what it said. Now, by the way, you think about, what country of origin people came from or whatever, And there's another option on this thing. I think that the draft violates the 13th Amendment, where you have involuntary servitude. But by the way, just as an interesting side note, and I keep having to look at the time and be careful, Utah is the only territory that had legal slavery for both people from the African nations as well as from the Native American nations. The only state wasn't a state at the time. 1852, Brigham Young prevailed upon the state legislature, there were the territorial legislature, and in a minute you'll see how they do that. But the territorial governor imposed his will upon the territorial legislature, and they made it legal to have slaves of both the Native Americans and the African origins. It was the only state, and it happened from 1852 to 1862, and the Congress, U.S. Congress intervened and canceled it. So it's a very interesting dynamic, and you go, wow. And part of that is the reason we had some of the Native American conflicts that we did here in Utah. Okay, in Amendment 13, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime. Now see how this applies to the draft. Whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And then, Section 2, Congress shall have power to enforce this. Okay, so that's what the 13th article said, or amendment said, and I believe it applies to this concept of ultimately having a draft, which I believe we would have had probably in April of 2020 had we not got distracted by the COVID con. But there had been a movement brought forward for universal military service. There were 3 levels of it. We won't go into all of that stuff, but every single boy and girl was going to be eligible, subject to, I guess is a better word, to be brought into slavery, my opinion, at different levels. We don't know what the exact bill would have looked like when it got done, but it looked like it was going to be an expanded age window, and there were no exceptions other than physical disability and mental disability. So if a young woman at age 28 had 4 children, she was still eligible for the draft. So it's one of those things that I think free nation doesn't need to go through. But that's the 13th Amendment. It got rid of the need to return so-called slaves to their so-called owners if they escaped. Okay, this is Article 4, Section 3, Clause 1. Quoting, new states may be admitted by the Congress into this union, but no new state shall be formed or erected within the jurisdiction of any other state, nor any state be formed by the jurisdiction of 2 or more states or parts of states without the consent of the legislatures of the states concerned as well as of the Congress. I have only had once in all the years I've been teaching this, anybody has ever instantly raised their hand and said, what about West Virginia? The kid was a 13-year-old. I'm going, you're homeschooled, aren't you? Anyway, so anyway, that's the only time anybody's ever brought that up, and I'm going to talk about West Virginia in just a minute. But you can't create another state off of another one constitutionally, but they did, 1863. Okay, so I have a list here. I'm not going to go through them all. I wished I could talk about every single one of them because of the circumstances in each one. You can see where these were major land acquisitions. Some were by purchase, some were by other conflicts, okay? The intent, and I'm gonna, let's see if I can find it here. Okay, the second dot on there, Northwest Ordinance 1787-89, that was the intent of how property, how land mass was going to be acquired. And their intention absolutely unequivocally and totally and completely, and I don't know how better to say that more emphatically, was that it was not to be done by conquest over the American natives. And the founding fathers were determined to have that happen. Then we get out here to Utah and we have slavery and we have wars. It's a tragic travesty. And it was in violation of the Northwest Ordinance, by the way, and how it was handled. We could talk about that at length. But these are times that we acquired fairly large land masses. And if you get down a little lower to the bottom, the last few, my attitude kind of shows through. Hawaii, scandalous usurpation. And we acquired them as a territory in 1900. They were an independent nation with a royal family and everything, and Americans there, through a revolution, decided that they were going to take over Hawaii. And I've read the articles in like the Deseret News from the time and everything. They fully and completely and unequivocally supported it. And it's like, holy Hannah. Anyway, that's not profanity, I don't think. But then we got some other territories through the Spanish War, and then the Virgin Islands we got in World War I. Okay, so these kinds of things, the farther down we come towards our modern history, the more scurrilous some of these things become. But during that process, we had a lot of, contrary to what the Northwest Ordinance, the second point on this list, was set up to do, they were not to be acquired by conquest. And the farther west we came, as the founding fathers died off, a lot of bad things happened. One of them was the conquest of the native tribes, and the other one was the withholding of the landmass of American territories. Utah is still subject to that at this point. 2/3 of the Utah landmass is owned by the general government. Okay, so we're going to talk about, and this Northwest Ordinance was created the summer of 1787 while the Constitution was being written in Philadelphia. It's a very foundational document. And I've got a slash there, 1787-89, because it was done before the United States Constitution was ratified. But when the Constitution was ratified and the government was constituted, on the 25th of September, 1789, they repassed the Northwest Ordinance saying, now we're under the Constitution. These are the rules of engagement for how you become a state. I just took one little section here saying that here's how you become a part of the general government. Okay, so become part of our nation. That was the intention. By the way, there was to be no slavery in any of those new states, new territories. Interesting kind of thing. Okay, the Articles of Confederation, by the way, said that new states can be brought in. And oh, by the way, let's bring Canada in. So this is Article 11 of the Articles of Confederation. This is the first Constitution of the United States. They intended, and they did invite Canada to join the nation. French Canadians squelched the idea. They do a lot of things that way. There's this guy, Trudeau, I think, that's still screwed up like that. But at any rate, but I put this in here just to say they knew they were going to grow. They were making an overture to Canada immediately. Canada turned it down. But then it says, no other colony shall be admitted to the same unless a mission be agreed to by 9 states. Okay, so we had to have a supermajority of the states say, yep, we're going to let this new state in. That isn't how it came about under the new Constitution. Congress would decide, and the states didn't have any say in that. Okay, we can read that clause again if you want to. What about West Virginia? There's no 13-year-olds in here that are homeschooled right now, so I'm going to tell the story. Okay, so the state of West Virginia originated in 1861. There was a convention that was held. This is after the state of Virginia had decided that they wanted out of the Union. Okay. Well, I mean, it gives me a headache to think about it, I think. Was Virginia still part of the nation or not? If it was, they couldn't make a state out of it. Well, if it wasn't, then they could maybe make a state out of it. But they can't have it both ways. So either Virginia was in or was out. But they always wanted it both ways, and that's how the 14th Amendment got so screwed up. But at any rate, so this convention was an assembly of Northwestern Virginia Southern Unionists. And Northwestern Virginia Southern Unionists. Think about that one for a minute. Put them on a map. Okay, so these guys decided, we don't want to leave with Virginia. So what happened? They wanted to repeal the Ordinance of Secession that Virginia had made as they seceded. And so West Virginia became one of 2 American states that formed during the Civil War, one being West Virginia, the other being Nevada. So West Virginia is the only state to be formed that was split from another state. It was split from Virginia. Was Virginia a state or not? If it was, they couldn't do it. If it wasn't, it was out of the Union, and you were waging war against somebody else that was no longer part of your country. It's a real mind bender. Okay, so they became a state in 1863. So they're the only one that got, and it's in violation of Article 4. Okay, so let's go on to Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2. Congress shall have power to dispose, this is a quotation, to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States, and nothing in this Constitution shall be so construed as to prejudice any claims of the United States or of any particular state. Okay, so it also put on this idea that they were going to oversee the territories as they came in, and as they became a critical mass, they would become a state. And the Northwest Ordinance outlined the philosophy that would drive the statehood. And so this Section 2, both state and House and Senate had to be involved in the disposal of U.S. property. Okay, so what's this big rigmarole at? Well, there were still controversies about what Western territories, how you were going to divide the state lines on some of the states. New York, Vermont, New Hampshire were some that were still in a controversy. They were trying to resolve that under the Articles of Confederation. It had not been done so yet. But under the Articles of Confederation, they had an adjudication process that was underway, and it was not completed. It was a pretty passionate thing. Where does the boundary stop and where does it start? And are you in this state or in that state? See, the people were state citizens more than anything else in those times. I'm a Virginian, first, last, and always, and that still continued into the 1860s. But so there were unresolved Western lands issues. So they didn't want to resolve or attempt to resolve this under the new Constitution. It would probably be an impediment to the ratification. Somebody in New York may say, no, I've got prior claim on that property or that land. You turkeys are not, if they had tried to we're drawing the lines in the Constitution, it was an impediment they didn't need. They were a very pragmatic set of individuals that were there. They knew they didn't want to throw more roadblocks in front of this thing than they had to. The slavery issue was one example of they had to take a step by step by step. So they weren't going to try to attempt to resolve these things. They wanted to avoid creating controversy, and that wouldn't derail the Constitution. And they deferred it to the Congress to resolve it. So all of this was a very deliberate kind of thing, and it succeeded. The people were coming in and said, you know what, Congress should be able to do that. We're going to continue what was started under the Articles of Confederation. We'll finish it under the new Constitution, and the guys that are writing the Constitution didn't try to be land surveyors. They were drawing lines on a map. By the way, that's where most of the problems in the Middle East come from right now. The Brits, after World War I, drew lines on a map. This is Iraq. This is Syria. Okay? And what they did is they wanted to be able to, this is a nation. We're going to deal with these people as we pillage their natural resources. They didn't put it in those terms. But that's how they were deciding it. They drew lines so they had a jurisdiction to actually go in and exercise claim on. And I think that, you guys can all say, have we got a mess in the Middle East right now? Yeah, we do. And it goes back to 7 or 8 years ago after World War I. What the Brits did by drawing lines on maps. And they basically screwed the Arabs. Still happening. But the point of the matter is that the American founders were smarter than that. We're not going to draw the lines. This stuff it'll be in a very deliberate process that we're not going to solve in our summer of 1787 as we're in Congress. In convention. Let's talk for a minute about the Panama Canal giveaway. Okay, now, boy, this is a big, and I would love to go into detail because this is a fascinating story of intrigue, bluster, and betrayal by the United States. Teddy Roosevelt and company and so on. So the area that the Panama Canal is in right now was Colombian territory. The United States facilitated a coup from the Panamanian province to break away from Colombia. And if you knew how we had we strong-armed our way to be able to stand in the way of the Colombians coming in and putting down the coup. And it was, okay, you're going to have to walk over us. And we had our whole military forces there, Navy and military arms and Army, everybody. The Colombians today still are smarting from this. They're ticked off at us, and rightly so, I think. But that's what happened. There was a coup. It was U.S. encouraged. We are the ones that said, as soon as they said, we're in charge down there, we said, okay, fine, you're authorized by us to be the charge of Panama. It was really one of those things. We stepped back a little while, and the French started to work on the canal in 1881. Okay, they were going to do a sea level thing like the Suez Canal. It was an absolute disaster. You couldn't do it. The mountains and the rivers and the lakes and the terrain and the weather and everything else. Oh, and the bugs and the snakes. I mean, it was a horrific country to try and do that in. And so they had financial collapse. There was a lot of reasons for that, including adultery and all sorts of other things in France. It was typical French way of doing business, okay? So you just have to understand this is the way the French do business. There was tons of engineering problems. There was no way in the world they were going to do a sea level thing with the differences between the surges in the sea on one side and on the other of the isthmus and everything. Work or death. I mean, hundreds, literally, per month were dying. Most of the senior management and their families died. They didn't know why. They didn't know the mosquitoes were the vector of yellow fever. Not only were there mosquitoes, but there were poisonous snakes on both sides of the canal and everything else like that. So there was a whole bunch of problem. So the United States purchased the canal zone with gold. This was a real purchase. This wasn't funny money that went down there. They bought it that way. It became U.S. territory. We owned it. We really still do. We went through and engineered, we financed it, we completed the project. Okay, so we took it over in 1906, opened the canal 10 years later. Eisenhower initiated the movement to give the canal to the Panamanians. This was during the 1950s. Out of the blue, hey, you guys want this back? It was a huge military strategic value to the United States. If you didn't have the canal to kind of go between the oceans or between the seas, you had to go clear around South America, or you had to go on the other side of the world and go down South Africa and India and everything else like that, okay? You stop and think about it, we need a blue water navy to protect our nation. And you say, oh, we got big airplanes and everything like that. Okay, you can bring teaspoons of stuff in with an airplane. You can bring cargo containers in a boat. And that was absolutely essential. In fact, one of my good friends who's passed away now, he spent most of World War II in the Panama Canal Zone protecting it from enemy intrusion. It was a strategic military requirement. Eisenhower was supposed to be a general. I heard that one time. But how he got to where he was is absolutely an intriguing kind of morass to me. Anyway, Eisenhower started in the 1950s this idea that he was going to give it back to the Panamanians. No, we bought it. It was ours. Our engineering, our money, everything was the United States. It was considered U.S. territory, like in Virgin Islands, or at the time, Hawaii, or whatever, okay? So they had this Torrijos-Carter Treaty, okay? And it was signed in 1977. Now, there was a senator from Arizona named DeConcini. He was a Democrat. He was probably better than 99% of the Republican senators now, and I don't say that without tongue in cheek. But he said, no, this is such a strategic value to us, we cannot just hand it over. And so when the treaty was before the United States Senate, 2/3 majority, this DeConcini amendment got passed. And DeConcini, it became known as the DeConcini Amendment. How about that? Okay, it got passed. It says, we will sign this treaty if it has this stipulation that the United States can be involved in the protection of the Panama Canal. Well, if it wasn't agreed to by Panama, we were withdrawing or not going to participate in it. So Carter refused to present that to the Panamanians. They probably knew about it, but officially they didn't know about it. Carter withheld strategic, important, critical legal information. Now, if you'd agreed to buy my house for $100,000 and I agreed to sell it to you for $1 million, do we have a contract? Why? They're not the same contract. That's what happened with Panama and Carter. Okay? So there's other problems. According to Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2, the House of Representatives has to agree to any transfer of U.S. property. I had a long discussion with Jim Hansen, who was our U.S. representative at the time. I said, Jim, you guys got to intervene on this thing. Oh, it's a treaty. His house has nothing to do with treaties. I said, Jim, don't be an asshole. I mean, I'm sorry, but this guy was a complete idiot. I said, you guys read your Article 4. You tell me that the House isn't part of the completion process of this. Oh, no, we didn't have anything to do. We went rounds for like 45 minutes on this thing. I mean, I'm sorry, but the House would not intervene. And had they intervened, it would not have been handed off, but it was. So there was some joint Panamanian-U.S. control. Panamanians took care in 1999 to take it over. It's now operated by a Panama Canal Authority. It's called Panamanian government, but it's really the Chinese that are running it. We have a daughter that spent some time down there, and it was Chinese run. Every lock, stock, and barrel, everything is by the Chinese. So another violation. Okay, the United States, this is Article 4, Section 4. The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government and shall protect each of them against invasion and on application of the legislature or the executive when the legislature cannot be convened against domestic violence. So all states are republics. They're to be constitutional republics. They can only act within the limits and bounds of the Constitution. It's a baseline principles that we find in our Declaration and everything about God-given rights that are preserved, consent of the governed, checks and balances, enumerated powers, separation of powers, limited to delegated authority. The idea was one bad apple in all the states will destroy the nation. They could not allow any of them to become a socialist republic of so-and-so or a democratic republic of such and such or anything like that. It was an Americanist, representative, constitutional form of government. And they also were going to be protected from invasion. The states were to be. I think we got one of those going right now, don't we? And I'm going to tell you a little quick story about something that happened 108 years ago. 108 years ago. Okay. And if the general government would be, if needed, the general government would come in and help restore order if there was an insurrection or anything like that, and if the legislative or the executive requested it. Okay, now let's go back in the Constitution about this invasion thing. Article 1, this is a legislative authority, Section 10, Clause 4, quoting, no state shall, without the consent of Congress, engage in war, unless actually invaded, or in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay. The states have the right of pushback. If you can't get it fixed, we're gonna help it happen. Okay, so let's go back and look at this Mexican invasion of 1916. Okay, it's the Battle of Columbus, New Mexico, in March of 1916. Pancho Villa incurred in the United States to resupply. Okay, how many are coming here to resupply? I don't know, all of them, because they're all picking our pockets right now, I guess. I don't know. So this little town of Columbus is 3 miles north of the border with Mexico. And what happened when, you're going to count them all individually in a minute here, 484 Mexicans came across the border. How many is that? Okay, let's see. We're doing 10 per minute. Every hour we have that many coming across right now, don't we? Anyway. So you'll see that in a minute. Townspeople responded with their personal firearms. They said, we are not going to allow this to occur. So there were 484 Mexicans involved. It went into a full-scale battle between the Mexicans. And the United States Army was not in Washington, D.C. or in Philadelphia or Minnesota. It was in the town. There was a fort of U.S. military guys, the 13th Cavalry. They were stationed in town, and they joined the common citizens in this repulsion of 484 Mexicans. Okay, this attack infuriated the Americans. By the way, Pancho Villa had about, we don't know for sure, but about 170 of his men killed. It was about, a third of the 484 Mexicans that were there were killed. We lost about a dozen Americans, I think. They were better shots, I guess. I don't know. But at any rate, read these next three things carefully. A National Guard unit showed up 5 months later, 100,000 troops on the border. National Guard says, we're here, baby. We're going to make sure this don't happen no more. These were people that were sent from all over America. By the way, the National Guard had only been around for about 13 years when this happened. Okay, so Woodrow Wilson ordered an army expedition to invade Mexico. They chased Pancho Villa around and failed to capture him during the next few months. And shortly thereafter, we got involved in World War I, and they called him home, and we sent all our guys over there. Blackjack Pershing, general, was there. First lieutenant, no, he was second lieutenant when he started. George Patton kind of got his first blood then. He personally killed some of Pancho Villa's lieutenants and put them on the hood of the car of the vehicle he was driving them and brought them back to the States. It's like, what is this, a bunch of deer that we tied on the hood of the car? I don't know. Patton was a gung-ho kind of guy. Anyway, so he was promoted to first lieutenant, and then not long after that, a captain, and the rest is history through World War II. Okay, we got a few minutes left. The American Founding Fathers had the original Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, in front of them in the summer of 1787, when they wrote the new Constitution. And I titled this, One of These Things is Not Like the Other. And like I say, I've got probably an hour and a half long presentation on the Articles of Confederation compared head to head to the United States Constitution. But this is just a few indications of they had the Articles, they knew what it said, and they didn't do what it said. They wrote a new one. There were reasons for that we could go into at some great length. There's no separate executive branch. There's no separate federal court systems in the Articles. It allowed recall of legislators. They said, yeah, I know, Virginia, we sent you to the Congress. You're coming home. We're sending somebody else in your place. Doesn't allow that in the new Constitution. Term limits were written into the new Constitution. One state, one vote in Congress. You might have 7 congressmen there, but you guys got to come to agreement and cast one vote in anything. So if there's 7 of you and 3 say yes and 4 say no, the answer is no. That's how it was done. By the way, this is exactly how the Convention of States people want to do things. Every state is going to get one vote. I say, wait a minute, California has 33 million and Wyoming has under 600,000. How's that going to ride? It ain't going to. California's not going to put up with it. But that's the way it was in the Articles of Confederation. All states were required to ratify any and all amendments. All amendments had to be ratified by all states. This federal-national relationship was whacked, and we're going to probably not have time to go in detail to Federalist Paper 39. You're going to have to read that yourself and or view of the Constitution of the United States. Okay, so there was only a unicameral legislative body. No House, no Senate. One body of Congress, no executive, no court. This is about a third of Article 11 about the judicial branch. There was none, but they said that all arguments have to be appealed to Congress. And they have a very complex way of how they put together a tribunal that's going to decide arguments because there's no court. It was only a Congress. And so, okay, we had something different. Constitution, Congress has power to constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. Article 2, the president nominates and basically appoints judges, okay? Article 3, there's a Supreme Court and inferior courts, and it sets up the rules of engagement. And then in Section 2, it says, here's the authority of the judicial power. So our United States Constitution much more clearly defined how the court system was going to work. Whereas under the Articles of Confederation, there was no court system. It was an appeal to Congress, and then they set up a tribunal, and then they had a hearing, and the states that were opposed on the different sides had input as to who was going to be on the tribunal, and if not, it got applied to different, very, very complex. In Article 5 of the Articles of Confederation, this is in Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution, the delegates got appointed annually, as the states directed, and the power was reserved to the states to recall their members from Congress. So they could say, come on down, baby. We're not agreeing with what you're doing up there. And so they replaced them. this happened so often, it was a total disruption. You know, the new presenting of credentials and acceptance and all this kind of stuff. So they sent others, even though it was only an annual replacement, they did this regularly. We're not going to do that under the new Constitution. Okay, so there's, it says in the bold print, no power to recall delegates is within the United States Constitution. Okay, so this is the term limits. They had a complex system by how often you could run for office. Okay, and that underlined bolded part talks about you can only be a delegate, meaning a member of the Congress, every so often for every so long. And there's no term limits in the US Constitution. These things were specifically left off. Okay, so one state, one vote, we already kind of touched upon that. This unicameral legislative body, no executive or judicial. And oh, here's an interesting thing. If Congress was not in session, they could have in charge a committee of the states. And so these one were to have a delegate from every state, and they were to appoint committees to manage the general affairs under their direction, a committee of states. So these guys were in charge when Congress wasn't in session, okay? Kind of an interesting thing. In the Constitution, there's no committee of states, and there's no convention of states as they're trying to have happen right now. So these con people are taking little phrases out of the articles, and they're trying to reapply them today. Okay. They're going to, this Article 13, under the Articles of Confederation, said the only way you can have an amendment is if all the states, all of them, agree. What's the chances of that? Slim and none. It ain't going to happen. So under the new Constitution, they said, yeah, we still want amendments to be gone through, and we want approval to be done. What if we did it with 9 states instead of all of them? That was a high bar, but yet it was reasonable, okay? So this 100% ratification was a real high bar. Oh man, we're out of time almost, but Federalist Paper 39 has, I'm just going to read a very short portion of it. I'm going to leave 5 minutes for questions. I know that we'll never take any more than that. Okay, Federalist Paper number 39 is, and it was also reiterated in St. George Tucker's view of the Constitution. He covered it. It was important enough to put these concepts into the view of the Constitution. The idea, is it a federal constitution or is it a national constitution? Federal meaning a group that have confederated together to run it together, or is it a national where there's a strict authority given to the general government? We're going to find out that Madison clearly states here it's not national and it's not federal. It is a mix of both based upon the needs that they've clearly come to understand since they got the mess of the Articles of Confederation. The Convention of the States people, and the reason I put this in here is because next time we get together, we're going to talk about Article 5. And Article 5 is going to talk about the modification process and or the calling of a convention. And you need to understand, and that's why I put it in this thing here, so that people could say, oh, I see where they're getting this idea for the Convention of the States, but they didn't like it, and they left that out. And here's why. Okay, so let's look at this national or confederation kind of thing, or federal. The proposed Constitution is in strictness neither a national, neither, not either, it's neither a national nor a federal constitution, but a composition of both. In its foundation, it is federal. Federal. That's the bringing together of states, isn't it? Okay. Not national. In the sources from which the ordinary powers of the government are drawn, it is partly federal and partly national. In the operation of these powers, it is national, not federal. And in the extent of them, again, it is federal, not national. I mean, how can you make these kind of arguments? But he clearly defined earlier in the Federalist Paper number 39, the instances where it was a national, this is from the last paragraph, by the way, he's summarizing. There are instances where it is absolutely natural, like the treaty making, the war making, those kinds of things. This idea of citizenship and so on, it's national. But it's federal in other aspects of it where the states have a say. Okay, going on. It's federal, not national. And finally, in the authoritative mode of introducing amendments, it is neither wholly federal nor wholly national. It's a blend and a mix based upon what they had come to discover, where some powers had to be in the hands of the general government, and other powers had to be tempered by the involvement of the states. And so Anti-Federalist paper number 10 didn't read this paper, I don't think, even though it had been published several months in advance of that. They were trying to make a point about where there was too much usurpation for too much power in different organizations. And this answered all of the issues in Anti-Federalist 10, which came several months later. And you just say, didn't you guys read this one? Anyway, okay, so next time we get together, we're going to talk about Article 5, the constitutional amendment process, the right of the people to alter or abolish their government. 1776 Declaration said we can change our government. We can throw it off by arms, or we can do it peacefully in this manner. And we're going to discuss that manner in the upcoming get-together. So we'll close with that. Any comments, arguments, discussion, and then I'll turn it back over to Enoch.
So I do have a question. Do you think that it's still possible via an election process for things to get better? And if
Okay. The question for those of us that are out in the Ethernet somewhere, do I think it's possible to have things corrected by the election process?
if so, what needs to happen?
Okay. Well, I truly, honestly, and honorably believe that it can be corrected by that process. I believe that there's some circumstances that are probably unlikely to allow that to happen. And so pragmatically, I've got to say, we the people have got to get involved. We the people do not understand. We do not care enough. I mean, I could give you example after example of people that have washed their hands of it and they're walking away. Some of them consider themselves to be sovereign citizens of one denomination or another. They will not even vote, some of these people. They hate the Constitution and want to overthrow it. They want a military junta. And all of these aren't in the same camp because there's different variations. But for heaven's sake, if you can't or won't participate in it, how is it going to happen? And if you're waiting until you take your AR-15 and run down the street shooting the windows out, what are you going to do after that happens? You'll be out of ammunition before you run out of enemies. And so we've got to get involved. We've got to make popular that which is sound and good, and unpopular that which is unsound. I believe that's an aphorism that we can live by. And we do that by, there's four steps, I believe. One is we've got to get right with God. And you know, we could give you quotation after quotation of the American founders. The Constitution was only made for a religious and a moral people. The pillars of our freedom are religion and morality. The concept of keeping our liberty without knowledge is, we can read Hosea or Isaiah or whatever, we're not going to keep it if we're ignorant, okay? All of those kind of things, but we've got to get right with God, number one, and that means a virtuous people, and that's a very individual process. Our individual hearts, our families, our congregations, our communities, and that's a process that we're going to have to try and make popular. Second thing is understand the principles of the founding and of where they came from, what they mean, how do we apply them. And if you don't understand that, you're going to think from each according to his ability to each according to his needs is an Americanist philosophy. It's Marxist. American kids don't understand that, and we've got to reinstill the baseline principles. Reading the United States Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the inaugural addresses, the farewell addresses, the Federalist Papers, and the view of the Constitution. These things we've talked about here. If you don't understand those principles, you can't defend them. And we make this personal. I say you. I know you'd probably be passionate in this enough to say, I want it. But we've got to become knowledgeable about the baseline principles. Next thing, very simply, we've got to be involved. We each individually need to step up and say, I'm in. This isn't going to happen on my watch. And the other thing is we've got to help others get involved. Okay, that's a very simplistic 4 points because we're out of time. But unless and until we do that, we're in grave danger. But I believe that the framework is there to restore. Now, half the nation hates the other half. Fragmentation lines are everywhere. They've decided how they can pit one side against race, religion against religion, men against women, the management against labor. I mean, you pick any fraction point you can, they're going to try and do it. And so we've got to try and find a way to pull this together and again begin to act like Americans that are committed to liberty. So it can be done. It's going to be really hard. And I think an honest election is probably not planned for in this particular go around. And I think we're going to be gravely disappointed regardless of what happens, because there's so many push points that could be violated on. So it's a tough, tough battle. But are you going to say, I'm out? You've said it's not possible, so I'm done. No, it's possible for all of us to participate under those rules. And I think that I'm not going to let on my watch, my grandkids, lose everything. It's just not going to happen if I can put anything on it. So sorry, it's a thing that it isn't a magic wand. We got this way because we quit caring. We're going to have to start caring and take it back. Okay. Do we want to end now because of the time? And
Yeah.
okay. Thank you, everybody. We appreciate you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Scott. I guess there's speakers right there. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks for coming. Online tonight, actually, I was pleasantly surprised. Our streaming listeners joined and stuck with us. So thanks to everyone who's watching and who's stuck. I'm glad Scott Bradley's presentation was engaging. So I just want to speak to everyone that is stumbling across this for the first time and whoever watches this later. Scott just shared with us about getting involved and being able to make a difference. And that's why we do what we do here tonight, is to first educate, learn these things that we need to know. And anyone that's willing to take the time to come here, to sit through this class, you are like at the top of the people who care in the way that needs to, we need to care about it. You want to actually learn the founding documents and how they work, the mechanics of government. A lot of people care, but they don't know this is as important as you guys understand it is, right? And if we don't know how the government is supposed to work, how are we going to know if our representatives are doing a good job? Or how are we going to instruct them on how to do a good job? How are we going to tell them, hey, you're violating, whatever principle here and there in a helpful way, not in an angry, calling all of them a communist, even though many of them are communists, right? But there's a principled way to kind of go about it. And Scott mentioned a few quotes from the founders where he talked about ambition checks ambition. That was the intended design. They expected humans to be humans, right? They knew they were going to be humans. So how do you structure government knowing that's going to happen, knowing that they're not going to be right all the time? Well, you pit them against each other in a way that actually protects the citizens. And so that's why we have a video on our channel on nullification and a few presentations on how that works. And then we've published this book, the Local Committee General Guidebook, okay, and it's by the American Committees Association, and that is the national counterpart to our local organization, Defending Utah. And it's our years of experience trying to understand when we're in a situation like we are now, as Scott mentioned, we're probably not getting a fair election this next time around, and probably not for quite some time. But maybe that's different in a small town. Maybe that can be at least partially different in a local area. And so this book is all about you, since you cared enough to come here, you're the top of the top. Since you're watching, then you didn't turn off your Twitter feed. I'm surprised Twitter was like skyrocketing in numbers. So yeah, it did better than YouTube. So he didn't turn it off. Why? Because there was something intriguing about what Scott was saying. Because he wasn't beating around the bush. He's getting into the passion of the founders, which is what we're all looking for. And so you're the cream of the crop. That means, like it or not, you're a leader. You're called to learn these things and spread them, because if you don't, no one else is going to. And so we've taken the idea that if some people care that much and want to learn, what do you do once you learn? And that's what this book is all about. It's ideas that are based on principle. It's not a complete how-to on how to fix everything, but it is a how-to on taking the ideas the founders had and trying to think of them in modern terms and be able to speak intelligently to your sheriff, to your city councilman. And yes, we know many of them are corrupt and beyond reach, but you don't know that until you first try some things. And then, but in some areas, you may be pleasantly surprised. I just spoke to a small town here in Utah, and the whole town, well, the majority of the council was really excited about the ideas that I had to say that come from this manual about enforcing the Constitution in your local area. Okay, cities can nullify what the feds do, what the states do, just like individuals can stand on claiming their rights, just like the state could nullify the feds and so forth. Ambition, the ambition of your city, can check against the ambition of the governor when he overreaches and says, I'm going to meter all your water wells. And if you're listening in Utah or any state, they're trying to meter all the water that you have access to in this country right now. And so, in fact, in this little town, I mentioned that, and afterwards they said, you're right, they're trying to do that to our town. We were wondering, what to do about that. So on the screen, on your screen right now, there is a link to start reading about this idea of committees. So if you want to check out that link, you can read on our page where we give you the introduction and we have some videos. And if you want to see more of these classes, we're going to keep having Dr. Bradley back, and we're going to hopefully grow this. We're going to do some fun things this summer. We're going to do a health freedom event where we're going to talk about I don't know if I can say this on YouTube, the cures. Yeah, I'll probably get cut off YouTube if I say that. But health freedom is always sticky on YouTube. But if you look up, let's see, G. Edward Griffin, World Without Cancer, we're going to get into the origins of where that came from. So we're looking into doing that this summer. But Scott is here every month so we can master the Constitution in ways that you don't really get most anywhere else. And so the other link on your screen is if you want to support what we're doing, become a member and get on our mailing list and come to our used to be weekly. But now we have monthly direct trainings. One is a Utah specific meeting. The other one's a national meeting. And then we have this boot camp, which is also national. So we hope you'll consider that. And we have a variety of other books on our website. So check those out. And that's about it. Thank you guys for coming. It's great to see you every month.
Recording stopped.